They say the most dangerous weapon in the world is a person with nothing to lose. But Kang Tae-jin, the Mafia boss of Seoul's Iron District, just found something much worse. At 2 a.m., he found a woman bleeding out on his border who had lost her name, her memory, and her past. The woman had no ID and no memory, but the black scorpion tattoo on her shoulder told him everything he needed to know. She was an elite from the Baek-ho Syndicate, the same family currently trying to dismantle his empire. He didn't save her to be a hero. He kept her to find out who she was meant to kill. At 2:30 a.m., the Iron District was a maze of wet asphalt and flickering neon. Tae-jin stood over the woman, his handgun steady. She was barefoot, her gray shirt stained dark, and a bruise was already deepening on her cheek. She looked up at him, her eyes empty of everything but shock, before her knees finally gave out. In Seoul, a woman like this is usually a liability, but for Tae-jin, she was a puzzle he couldn't afford to ignore. The sound of a handgun slide racking back woke her. It was a sharp, mechanical noise that felt familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. Aria opened her eyes to a sterile white room, and the sight of a man standing at the foot of her bed. He'd taken off his suit jacket, but he still looked like he was on the job. He wasn't looking at her face, he was staring at the ink on her shoulder. "The man who wears that mark burned my father's warehouse to the ground," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "The Baek-ho don't lose their people, and they certainly don't leave them at my borders. So what's the play? Are you a spy, or is someone using you as bait?" "I don't know," Aria rasped. Her throat felt like it was full of sand. She tried to sit up, but the room spun. "I don't remember the tattoo. I don't remember you. All I can see is a man with a scar and the sound of the rain." Tae-jin didn't lower the gun. Across the room, one of his men leaned in. "Boss, the Baek-ho scouts are already hitting the perimeter. They're looking for her. If we keep her here, we're starting a war we aren't ready for." Tae-jin looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the fear, but he also saw a strange, stubborn look in her eyes. He reached out and touched the edge of the tattoo on her collarbone. "Let them come," he said. "If she's their precious weapon, I want to see what happens when I'm the one holding it." The medical suite was a sterile, soundproof box that smelled of ozone and antiseptic. Outside, the estate was a hive of activity as the perimeter guards doubled their patrols, but inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, hollow beep of the heart monitor. Aria lay against the dark leather of the examination table, her skin looking almost translucent under the high-intensity halogen lamps. The doctor, a man named Han who had been on Tae-jin's payroll for a decade, moved with a clinical silence, his gloved hands adjusting the overhead light until it burned white against Aria's left shoulder. Tae-jin stood at the edge of the light's radius, his shadow stretching across the floor. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, but he hadn't relaxed. He watched the way the light caught the ink of the scorpion. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, the way the legs seemed to grip her collarbone, the stinger curving upward toward her throat. He'd seen this mark on the bodies of high-ranking Baek-ho enforcers he'd left in alleyways, but those were usually rough, jagged things. This was different. "Look at the tail, boss," Han whispered, leaning in with a magnifying loupe. He didn't wait for an invitation. He grabbed a surgical pen and pointed to the very tip of the stinger. "Most Baek-ho marks are solid ink. It's meant to be visible, a warning. But this, the artist used a different needle here. A finer one." Tae-jin stepped into the heat of the lamp. He leaned down until he could see what the doctor was talking about. Right where the stinger would deliver its venom, there were 3 tiny geometric dots. They weren't part of the shading. They were perfectly symmetrical, etched with a precision that required a steady hand and a purpose. Aria stirred then, her dark hair fanning out across the table as she turned her head toward him. Her eyes were wide, the pupils still dilated from the sedatives, but the confusion was being replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of panic. She tried to pull her shirt up, her fingers fumbling with the light gray fabric. "Don't," Tae-jin said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a threat either. He reached out and gently caught her wrist, his skin warm against her cold pulse. "The doctor is just looking at the ink. You aren't in danger here, Aria. Not from us." "That mark," she rasped, her voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. "Why does it make my head ache when I look at it? Why does it feel like a weight?" Tae-jin let go of her wrist and looked back at the dots. "Because it isn't just a badge of membership. The Baek-ho chairman is a man who trusts no one. He doesn't keep his secrets in ledgers or on servers that can be hacked. He keeps them on people. You aren't just one of his scorpions, Aria. You're a vault." He straightened up and looked at Han. A code. It's a sequence, isn't it? The doctor nodded slowly. It looks like the start of an encryption key, or a physical coordinate. If there are more marks like this hidden in the rest of the tattoo, she's carrying enough data to bankrupt the Baek-ho in a single afternoon. That's why they're hitting the borders. They aren't trying to rescue a sister. They're trying to recover a hard drive before it falls into the wrong hands. Aria sat up, the room clearly spinning for her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. If I have what he wants, if I'm this key, then he's never going to stop, is he? Tae-jin holstered his gun, the leather of the holster creaking in the quiet room. He looked at her, at the bruise on her cheek and the strange, quiet defiance that refused to break even now. The realization of what she was changed the math of the war. She wasn't a liability anymore. She was the finish line. He won't stop, Tae-jin agreed, his voice a low, level rumble. He'll burn this entire district to the ground, to keep you from remembering what those dots unlock. But he forgot one thing. What? Aria asked. He left you in my territory, Tae-jin said. He turned to his lieutenant, who was waiting by the door. Lock the wing down. Nobody in or out without my thumbprint. If the Baek-ho want their key back, they're gonna have to come through me to get it. And I've been looking for a reason to finish this fight for a long time. He looked back at Aria, whose gaze was fixed on him with a mixture of terror and an emerging, dark recognition. The silent war was over. The loud one was about to begin, and for the first time in years, Tae-jin felt like he was holding all the cards. He just had to make sure the woman in front of him survived long enough to play them. The suite Tae-jin had assigned her was too large and too quiet, a sprawling maze of dark wood and marble that felt less like a bedroom and more like a high-security holding cell. Aria sat by the window, watching the rain continue its relentless assault on the glass. She looked at her reflection, but the person staring back was a stranger. Her own face felt like a mask she didn't know how to take off. The memory loss wasn't a fog, it was a physical wall. Every time she tried to reach back into her past, she hit a flat, cold void that left her nauseous. It wasn't just that she had forgotten her birthday or her mother's face, she had forgotten the basic rhythm of her own life. She didn't know if she liked the rain or if she preferred her coffee black. Her brain felt like a hard drive that had been wiped with bleach, leaving behind only the most primal instincts: how to breathe, how to flinch, and how to watch the door. The door clicked open and Tae-jin stepped in. He wasn't wearing the gun this time, but he didn't need it to look dangerous. He carried a thin file and a cup of tea that smelled of ginger. He set the cup on the small table beside her without saying a word, his movements efficient and grounded. Dr. Han finished the blood work, Tae-jin said, leaning against the heavy mahogany desk. He watched her with a focus that made Aria feel like she was under a microscope. It wasn't just the hit to your head that did this to you, Aria. You have a cocktail of specialized neuroinhibitors in your system. It's a drug the Baek-ho use for cleansing, erasing the memories of assets who know too much or who have outlived their usefulness. Aria looked down at the ginger tea, the steam rising in thin, ghostly curls. Why not just kill me? If I'm a threat, a bullet is cheaper than a drug. Because a bullet is final, Tae-jin replied, his voice dropping to that low-level rumble. The chairman is a hoarder. He doesn't like losing things he owns. He wanted you alive but empty, a blank slate he could store in a cage until he needed the data in your head again. The drug was meant to lock the door to your memory, not destroy the room. But something went wrong. You got out. Aria reached up and touched the bruise on her cheek. I don't feel like I got out. I feel like I'm still in the cage. I just don't know who the jailer is. I think you do, Tae-jin said. He took a photo out of the file and slid it across the table. The image was grainy, taken from a long-distance surveillance camera. It showed a man with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, standing on a pier. He was tall, dressed in a silk suit that looked out of place in the industrial setting. The moment Aria's eyes hit the photo, the wall in her head didn't just crack, it shattered. The smell of ginger tea vanished, replaced by the acrid, biting scent of sea salt and diesel. The room in the estate was gone. She was standing on a pier, the wind whipping her hair into her eyes. The man with the scar was right in front of her, his hand wrapped tight around her throat. He wasn't choking her, but he was holding her with a proprietary cruelty that made her skin crawl. You're the only one who has the frequency, Aria, the scarred man whispered in her mind, his voice a raspy, grating sound that felt like sandpaper. The ledger stays with you. If you even think about handing it to the Iron District, I won't just kill you. I'll make sure you forget you ever existed before I feed you to the harbor. In the vision, Aria didn't beg. She looked the man in the eyes and did something that terrified the version of her sitting in the chair now. She smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression that didn't belong on the face of a victim. Aria gasped, her body jerking back as the vision dissolved. She knocked the ginger tea over, the hot liquid spilling across the table, but she didn't notice. Her hands were shaking, and her chest felt like it was being crushed. "The peer," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He was there. The man with the scar. He called me Aria, but he wasn't my friend. He was my handler, and he was terrified of me." Tae-jin was at her side in a second, his hand steadying her shoulder. He didn't pull away when she gripped his arm, her nails digging into the fabric of his shirt. He looked at the spilled tea and then back at her, his obsidian eyes searching her face. "He was right to be afraid," Tae-jin said quietly. "If you're starting to see him, it means the drug is wearing off. And if you're the one who has the frequency to the Baek-ho's entire operation, you aren't just a key, Aria. You're the detonator." Aria looked up at him, her lips slightly parted in a shallow, terrified breath. For the first time, she saw something in Tae-jin's eyes that wasn't just calculation. It was a fierce, protective recognition. He wasn't just keeping her alive to win a war. He was looking at her like she was the only other person in the world who understood what it was like to be a monster. "I don't want to remember," she admitted, her voice a small, broken sound in the large room. "The woman on that pier. I don't think she was a good person." Tae-jin didn't lie to her. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He just tightened his grip on her shoulder, a silent promise of weight in a world that felt like it was floating away. "In this city, being a good person is just another way to get yourself killed. I don't need you to be good, Aria. I need you to be the woman who made that man with the scar afraid to sleep at night." The morning air in the study felt like iron, heavy and cold. Aria sat in a velvet chair that seemed to swallow her small frame, her eyes fixed on the man with the scar in the surveillance photo. The ginger tea she'd spilled earlier had been cleaned away, but the scent still lingered, a ghost of the girl she had been only an hour ago. Across from her, Tae-jin stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, jagged line against the gray Seoul sky. He wasn't looking at the view, he was watching her reflection in the glass. He turned slowly, and the weight of his presence moved with him. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked to the mahogany desk and pulled a heavy drawer open. The sound of wood sliding against wood was loud in the silence. He reached inside and pulled out a black semi-automatic handgun. He didn't point it at her, not yet, but the way he held it, with a steady, practiced grip, made the air in the room feel thin. "You said the man on the pier was your handler," Tae-jin said, his voice dropping to a low, level rumble. "But handlers don't look at their assets the way he was looking at you." He looked like he was holding onto a grenade with the pin already pulled. Aria looked up, her pulse thrumming in her throat. "I don't know why. I just know that when I looked at him in that vision, I wasn't scared. I was waiting for him to blink." Tae-jin walked toward her, the gun held down by his side. "The neuroinhibitors in your blood are designed to make you compliant. They're supposed to turn a person into a tool that only moves when it's told. But you didn't just walk away from the Baek-ho, Aria. You chose my territory. You chose the one place in this city where the chairman's name carries no weight." He stopped a few feet from her and finally raised the weapon. He didn't do it with anger. It was a cold, calculated movement. He leveled the barrel with her forehead. Aria didn't flinch. She just looked at the dark circle of the muzzle, her breathing shallow but steady. "Tell me the truth," Tae-jin commanded. "If the drug is wearing off and you're starting to see the pier, what else are you seeing? Because the Baek-ho don't just lose keys. They lose traitors. Did you steal that frequency, or were you the one who built the vault in the first place?" "I don't know." Aria's voice cracked, and she finally stood up, her knees trembling. She took a step toward him, closing the distance until the cold steel of the barrel was pressed directly against her skin. "I can feel things shifting in my head, Tae-jin. It's like a storm is coming, and I'm terrified of who is going to be standing here when the clouds clear. If I'm a monster, if I'm the person who helped that man on the pier do whatever he did, then finish it. Pull the trigger. I'd rather die as the person I've been for the last 2 days than wake up as whatever is hidden under this tattoo." Tae-jin's finger didn't move on the trigger, but his knuckles turned white. He saw the raw desperation in her glistening eyes, a mix of quiet defiance and absolute terror. He had spent his life surrounded by people who lied to survive, but this woman was begging for the end because she was afraid of her own shadow. It was the most honest thing he had seen in years. "The girl I found at the border was a ghost," Tae-jin murmured, his voice softening just a fraction. He lowered the gun, but he didn't holster it. But the woman standing in front of me right now is something else. You're asking for a bullet because you think it's the only way to stop the past from catching up. But in my world, we don't run from the darkness. We own it. He reached out with his free hand, his thumb tracing the faint reddish bruise on her cheekbone. It was a human gesture, startlingly warm against her skin. I'm not going to kill you, Aria. Not today. But if you lied to me, if you're just a very good actress playing the part of a victim, I'll be the one who puts you back in that cage. Do you understand? Aria nodded, her lips slightly parted as she caught her breath. The gun was no longer at her head, but the tension in the room hadn't broken. It had just changed shape. She realized then that she wasn't just his prisoner or his patient. She was his gamble. I understand, she whispered. Good, Tae-jin said, finally holstering the weapon. The Baek-ho are moving. My scouts say the man with the scar has been seen in the district. He's coming for his key. We have maybe 12 hours before this estate becomes a fortress. You need to try and remember those 3 dots, Aria. Because when the door kicks in, I need to know if I'm fighting for a woman or a war. The afternoon light had long since died, replaced by a thick, oppressive fog that rolled off the Han River and swallowed the estate's grounds. Inside the study, the air was heavy with the smell of cold cedar and gunpowder. Tae-jin hadn't moved from his position near the monitors, his dark eyes tracking the flickering infrared feeds of the perimeter. He had shed his tie, the top buttons of his white shirt pulled open, revealing the tension held in the cords of his neck. He looked like a man waiting for a storm he knew he couldn't outrun. Aria sat on the edge of the leather sofa, her hands tucked between her knees to stop the trembling. She felt like a glass ornament in a room full of iron. Every time the wind rattled the window pane, her heart kicked against her ribs. The drug was still a heavy veil over her mind, but the cracks were wider now. She could almost feel the presence of the men outside, a collective shadow moving through the trees, their intent vibrating in the air like a low-frequency hum. They're not coming with a frontal assault, Tae-jin said, his voice a low, level rumble that cut through the silence. The Baek-ho don't do theater. They do precision. They'll cut the power first, then the secondary lines. They want to isolate this wing before I can move you to the bunker. Can't we just leave? Aria asked, her voice small and raspy. If I'm the one they want, if I'm the key, why stay here and wait for the door to break? Tae-jin turned, and for a second, the obsidian depth of his eyes softened as they landed on her. Because out there, you're a target in a field. In here, you're behind 6 inches of reinforced steel and a dozen men who would die before they let a Baek-ho blade touch you. We don't run, Aria. We dig in. As if punctuated by his words, the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. The hum of the air conditioning cut out, leaving a silence so absolute it felt like it was pressing against Aria's eardrums. A second later, the red emergency lights kicked in, bathing the study in a sickly, crimson glow that made the shadows look like blood. Tae-jin didn't panic. He reached into the small of his back and drew his semi-automatic, the metallic slide clicking home with a sound that made Aria flinch. It started. Stay behind the desk. Don't move unless I tell you to. He didn't have to tell her twice. Aria scrambled into the knee-hole of the heavy mahogany desk, pulling her legs tight to her chest. From her vantage point, the world was reduced to the sight of Tae-jin's boots and the rhythmic pulse of the red lights. Then came the sound, a muted, crystalline tinkle from the hallway upstairs. A window had been breached. Not shattered, but cut with a diamond-tipped precision that spoke of professional work. A muffled thud followed, then the rapid, suppressed chug-chug-chug of a silenced submachine gun. Someone screamed, one of Tae-jin's guards, but the sound was cut short, ending in a wet, choking gurgle. Aria squeezed her eyes shut, her forehead resting against the cool wood of the desk. The static in her head began to roar, a high-pitched whine that synchronized with the footsteps approaching the study door. She didn't have her memory, but her body was reacting with a terrifying, mechanical competence. Her heart rate slowed. Her breathing became shallow and silent. Her muscles coiled, not in a defensive crouch, but in a predator's spring. She didn't understand why, but she knew exactly how many steps it would take for those men to cross the threshold. Tae-jin, she whispered, the name feeling like a prayer and a warning. The door didn't burst open. It was eased aside, a sliver of darkness widening against the red light. Tae-jin fired twice, the reports of his gun deafening in the small space. A body hit the floor, the heavy thud of tactical gear echoing off the walls. But there were more. Aria could hear the rhythmic breathing of at least 3 men, the sound of boots scuffing against the rug. "The asset is in the room," a voice hissed from the hallway, the same raspy, grating voice from the pier. "Target the boss. Take her alive, or don't come back at all." Tae-jin ducked behind a high-backed chair, returning fire as the air in the room filled with the smell of drywall dust and ozone. He looked back at the desk, his jaw tight, his eyes searching for her in the shadows. He saw her pale face peeking out, her lips slightly parted in terror, but he also saw something else, a flicker of something sharp and lethal behind her glistening eyes. The key wasn't just in her head anymore, it was starting to turn in the lock. And as the Baek-ho enforcers poured into the room, Tae-jin realized the silent war had just turned into a slaughterhouse, and he was the only thing standing between the girl and the ghosts who had come to claim her. The red emergency lights strobed against the walls, turning the study into a rhythmic, bloody blur. Tae-jin was pinned behind the heavy mahogany desk now, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. He fired a volley toward the doorway, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face. He looked like a man who knew he was running out of floor space. The Baek-ho silencers moved like smoke, shifting between the shadows of the bookshelves, their suppressed weapons spitting lead that chewed through the leather chairs and shattered the glass of the liquor cabinet. Aria was curled in the darkness of the desk's shadow, her hands pressed over her ears. Every time a bullet thudded into the wood above her head, the wall in her mind groaned. It wasn't a memory of a face or a name that broke the lock, it was the sound. The specific, mechanical click of a jammed HK, VP9 in the hallway. The static in her brain suddenly tuned into a clear, terrifying frequency. Tae-jin's gun ran dry. The slide locked back with a hollow metallic clack that sounded like a death knell. In that half-second of silence, a Baek-ho enforcer lunged from the shadows, a combat knife gripped in a reverse strike. He was fast, a professional killer aiming for the gap in Tae-jin's defense. Tae-jin reached for his spare magazine, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. Aria didn't think. She didn't have time to wonder who she was or what she was doing. Her body simply took over, acting with a grace and violence that felt more natural than breathing. She surged out from under the desk, her movements so fluid she seemed to glide across the floor. Before the attacker could bring the blade down on Tae-jin, Aria caught his wrist. There was no hesitation, no struggle. With a sharp, practiced twist, she snapped the bone, the sound of it sickeningly clear in the quiet room. She didn't stop there. She used the man's own momentum to spin him, her elbow driving into his temple with the force of a hammer. As he crumpled, she stripped the knife from his hand, the weight of the steel fitting into her palm like a missing piece of her own soul. "Aria?" Tae-jin's voice was a low, shocked rasp. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She was gone, replaced by a machine that calculated trajectories and kill zones. Another shadow appeared in the doorway, a submachine gun rising to sweep the room. Aria didn't hide. She threw the knife. It wasn't a desperate toss, it was a calibrated strike. The blade buried itself in the man's throat before he could pull the trigger. She was already moving before he hit the ground. She scooped up a fallen handgun, checked the chamber with a flick of her thumb, and fired 3 times into the hallway. Each shot was a rhythmic, clinical execution. The room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant alarm and the heavy, wet sound of a body sliding down the doorframe. Aria stood in the center of the room, the luminous, fair skin of her arm splattered with crimson. She wasn't shaking. Her hands were as steady as the desk she had been hiding under. She looked down at the man she had just killed, then at the gun in her hand. The static was gone, replaced by a cold, structural understanding of the world. She remembered the weight of a rifle. She remembered the smell of a shooting range. She remembered the feeling of a life ending under her fingers. "I wasn't a victim," she whispered. Her voice was no longer raspy. It was flat, level, and chillingly calm. She turned to look at Tae-jin, her dark eyes vacant and terrifying. "They didn't come to retrieve an asset, Tae-jin. They came to decommission a defective part." Tae-jin stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the woman who had just saved his life with the efficiency of a ghost. He saw the way she held the gun, not like a girl in terror, but like a professional at work. The bruise on her cheek was still there, but the vulnerability was gone, burned away by the realization of what she truly was. "You're not a scorpion," Tae-jin realized, his voice a low vibrating rumble of dark fascination. "You're the one who trained them." Aria looked at the tattoo on her shoulder. The scorpion seemed to pulse in the red light, no longer a mark of a prisoner, but a signature of a predator. "I am the reason the Baek-ho exist," she said, finally looking him in the eye. and I think I'm the reason they're going to stop. The smoke from the firefight hung in the air like a heavy curtain, gray and bitter. Aria didn't drop the gun. She stood in the center of the wreckage, her tactical stance perfectly centered, while Tae-jin's men filtered into the room to clear the bodies. The red emergency lights had stopped strobing, replaced by a steady, dim crimson glow that made the blood on the floor look like spilled ink. Tae-jin watched her for a long beat before he moved. He didn't approach her like a survivor. He approached her like a rival. He reached into the small of his back, drew his spare weapon, and leveled it at her chest. "Drop it," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that held no warmth. "Now." Aria didn't flinch. She looked at the barrel of his gun, then back at his obsidian eyes. The vacant look was gone, replaced by a sharp, terrifying clarity. "You're smart to be afraid, Tae-jin. If I were you, I wouldn't trust me either." She slowly bent her knees, placed the handgun on the floor, and slid it across the rug toward his boots. "The erase protocol," she murmured, her voice flat and level. "It wasn't something they did to me. It was my exit strategy." Tae-jin didn't lower his weapon. "Explain. Before I decide you're more dangerous than the men you just killed." Aria walked toward the mahogany desk, her movements fluid and deliberate. She ignored the blood on her hands and pulled the laptop toward her. "The chairman is obsessed with security. He didn't want a digital ledger that could be hacked or a physical one that could be stolen. So he turned me into the ledger. Every offshore account, every bribe to the Seoul police, every coordinate for their human trafficking hubs, it was all etched into my brain through a series of mnemonic triggers." She pointed to the scorpion tattoo on her shoulder. "The dots in the stinger are the first part of a sequence. To unlock the data, I had to see them in a mirror while my heart rate was at a specific frequency. It was a failsafe. If I was captured and tortured, my heart would be too fast or too slow to trigger the memory. I had to be calm. I had to be in control." Tae-jin stepped closer, the gun still steady. "So why the amnesia? Why the border?" "Because I betrayed him," Aria said, finally looking up. A flicker of quiet defiance returned to her eyes. "I saw what he was planning for the Iron District. He wasn't just coming for the territory. He was going to use your people as collateral for a deal with the Russian syndicates. He was selling them the families who live in your lower districts. He had it all mapped out, who was young enough to work and who wasn't. I've done a lot of bad things for him, and I've hurt a lot of people, but I couldn't live with myself knowing I helped him treat human beings like cargo. I didn't just steal his bank codes to get rich. I did it to stop him from selling the lives of the people you protect. I couldn't stop him from the inside, so I triggered the erased protocol myself. I took a massive dose of the neuroinhibitors to wipe my own surface memory. I knew if I forgot who I was, they couldn't beat the location of the ledger out of me. I just had to hope I'd end up somewhere they couldn't reach." "You chose my territory," Tae-jin realized, the realization settling in with a heavy chill. "You used me as a shield." "I used you as a weapon," Aria corrected. She stood up and walked directly into the line of his fire, stopping when the muzzle of his gun pressed against her sternum. "I am the only person who can dismantle the Baek-ho. I have the bank codes. I have the names. But I can't do it alone. You want to finish this war? Then stop looking at me like a ghost and start looking at me like an ally." The silence in the room was absolute. Tae-jin looked down at the woman, who had played a high-stakes game of chess with her own mind. He saw the beast inside her, the one that had snapped bones and thrown blades with clinical precision, and he saw the woman who had sacrificed her very identity to stop a monster. Slowly, Tae-jin lowered the gun. He didn't holster it, but he let it hang by his side. "The man with the scar. He knows you're remembering." "He knows," Aria agreed. "And he knows that as long as I'm standing in your house, his empire is a house of cards." "We don't have 12 hours anymore, Tae-jin. We have until the sun comes up." Tae-jin reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of the scorpion tattoo. For the first time, the touch wasn't just about curiosity, it was a pact. "Then we'd better start burning those cards," he said. "Show me the first account. Let's see how much the chairman is willing to lose before he dies." The rain had finally tapered off into a miserable, freezing mist that clung to the windows of the estate. The mansion was quiet again, but it was a jagged kind of silence, the kind that follows a storm but precedes a flood. In the private wing, far from the blood-stained rugs of the study, Aria sat on the edge of a wide, unmade bed. She had washed the blood from her hands, but the skin beneath her fingernails still felt stained. The luminous, fair complexion of her face was ghost pale in the dim light of a single bedside lamp, and the reddish bruise on her cheek had turned a deep, ugly purple. She felt like an intruder in her own body. The memories were returning in sharp, painful bursts, the weight of a sniper rifle, the taste of cheap cigarettes on a stakeout, the cold satisfaction of a job completed. This was the woman who had lived under the skin of the ghost Tae-jin had rescued. She wasn't a girl who needed saving. She was a predator who had forgotten her own teeth. The door opened softly, and Tae-jin stepped in. He had changed into a clean black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He didn't look like a boss right now. He looked like a man who had seen too much, and was still trying to make sense of the math. He carried a small first aid kit, setting it down on the nightstand with a quiet click. "You should be sleeping," he said, his voice a low, level rumble. "I don't think I know how to sleep anymore," Aria replied, her voice steady but hollow. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the people I've killed. Not as shadows, but as names. I remember their faces. I remember why I was told to do it." She looked up at him, her dark eyes glistening with a raw, quiet defiance. "The girl you found at the border, she was innocent. She was soft. I hate that she's gone, Tae-jin. I hate that I'm the one who came back." Tae-jin sat on the edge of the bed, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He opened the kit and pulled out an antiseptic wipe. "That girl at the border was a lie you told yourself to survive. She was a shield. But she couldn't have survived what's coming next. Only you can do that. The worst part isn't the fighting, Tae-jin. It's how I ended up with him in the first place. I finally remembered my dad. I was only 14, living in a small apartment. My dad was a good man, but he couldn't pay the protection money the chairman demanded. I hid in a closet and watched the chairman kill him. Then he found me, wiped the tears off my face, and told me he was my new family. He spent 10 years lying to me, making me believe he had saved me from the streets. He made me feel grateful to the man who murdered my father. He didn't just take my memory this week, Tae-jin. He stole my whole life and turned me into the very thing that killed my dad." He reached out, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he tilted her chin up to examine the bruise on her cheek. Aria didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, a small, involuntary movement that shattered the professional distance between them. For a moment, the air in the room changed, the lethal tension of the war outside replaced by a heavy magnetic pull. "I used you," she whispered, her breath hitching. "I planted myself in your path because I knew you were the only man who wouldn't blink when the Baek-ho came knocking. I manipulated your territory, your men, even you." "I know," Tae-jin said, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers. He didn't look angry. If anything, there was a dark, fierce adoration in his gaze. "In my world, everyone is a chess piece, Aria. I've spent my life moving people around a board. But you're the first person who ever sat across from me and played the game better. I don't care that you used me. I care that you're still standing." He moved his thumb from her chin to the edge of the scorpion tattoo on her shoulder. The touch was lingering, a silent acknowledgement of the monster beneath the silk of her blouse. "You're afraid that if you fully remember who you are, I won't be able to look at you the same way. You think you're a monster because you know how to kill." He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. "But look at me, Aria. Look at what I've built. Do you think I got this district by being a good man?" Aria looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same shadows she felt in her own soul. He wasn't a sanctuary, he was a mirror. The realization didn't terrify her, it grounded her. "We're both monsters," she murmured, her lips slightly parted. "Maybe," Tae-jin agreed, his voice dropping to a vibrating whisper. "But at least we're not alone in the dark anymore." He didn't kiss her. It wasn't the time for that. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, a silent truce in a world that wanted them both dead. In that small, quiet space, the assassin and the boss vanished, leaving behind only two people who had found the only thing they could trust in a city of lies: each other. Aria closed her eyes, and for the first time since the border, the static in her head went silent. She wasn't a key or a ledger. She was home. The dawn that broke over the Iron District was the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly mix of purple and gray that bled into the horizon. Inside the estate's garage, the air was cold and smelled of gasoline and old concrete. Aria stood by the sleek black sedan, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes as hard as the obsidian desk she had sat behind for days. She was no longer wearing the light gray borrowed clothes of a victim. She was dressed in tactical black, fitted, functional, and silent. She checked the weight of the handgun at her hip, the movement fluid and second nature. The static in her mind had fully settled into a cold, sharp blade of memory. She knew exactly where the Serpent's Wharf was, and she knew exactly how many guards would be stationed at the north gate. Most importantly, she knew the man with the scar would be waiting in the center of it all, believing he was still holding the leash. She didn't wait for a goodbye. She didn't want the hesitation that came with looking at the man who had given her a name when she had none. She reached for the car door, but the heavy mechanical click of a safety being switched off stopped her in her tracks. "You were always a terrible liar, Aria." Tae-jin's voice came from the shadows of the concrete pillars. He stepped into the dim light, looking every bit the predator he was. He had traded his suit jacket for a heavy tactical vest, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing the tension in his arms. He didn't look angry that she was trying to leave. He looked like a man who had already accounted for the betrayal. "This is my debt, Tae-jin," Aria said, her voice chillingly level. "I'm the one who stole the ledger. I'm the one who burned their bridges. If I go alone, I can end this without turning your district into a graveyard." "You think I care about the district?" Tae-jin walked toward her, his boots thudding against the concrete with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He stopped inches from her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "I've spent 10 years building walls around this place, so that no one could tell me what to do. You think I'm going to let some scarred ghost from your past walk in here, and take the only thing I've found that's worth keeping?" "I'm a liability," she argued, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "As long as I'm with you, you're a target." "I was a target the day I was born," Tae-jin countered, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, dark adoration. He reached out and placed a hand on the roof of the car, effectively pinning her between the steel and his body. "You're the architect of this war, Aria. You have the codes, the names, and the strategy. But an architect needs a sword to clear the ground. And in this city, there isn't a blade sharper than mine." Aria looked up at him, her lips slightly parted. She saw the beast in him, the one that had been rattling its cage since the first night they met, and she realized he wasn't doing this out of mercy. He was doing it because he recognized that they were two halves of the same lethal whole. "The chairman will have everyone there," she warned. "It's a trap, Tae-jin. He knows I'm coming." "Good," Tae-jin said, a predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It saves me the trouble of hunting them down one by one. I'd rather kill them all in the same room anyway. It's cleaner." He didn't wait for her permission. He moved to the driver's side and slid in, the engine roaring to life and echoing off the garage walls like a challenge. Aria stood there for a second, the cold morning wind whipping at her jacket, before she walked around and climbed into the passenger seat. As they tore out of the estate and onto the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, the silence between them was no longer filled with secrets or drug-induced fog. It was the silence of a loaded gun. They weren't a boss and his captive anymore. They were the fire and the wind, headed straight for the heart of the syndicate that had tried to erase them. And for the first time in her life, Aria didn't feel like a weapon being wielded by someone else. She felt like the hand on the trigger. The Serpent's Wharf smelled of old rust, diesel fuel, and the bitter chill of the ocean. The fog was so thick it swallowed the harbor lights, leaving only a sickly yellow glow on the wet wooden docks. Aria stepped out of the car, her boots hitting the gravel with a soft crunch. She didn't look over her shoulder to check if Tae-jin was there. She could feel him. He was a solid, grounding presence at her back, the heavy shadow that made the cold air feel electric. The man with the scar was waiting at the end of the pier. The chairman was flanked by a dozen of his best men, his dark coat damp from the mist. He looked exactly the way he had in her nightmares, standing tall with the arrogant smirk of a man who believed he owned the world. "I knew you would come back," the chairman called out, his raspy voice echoing over the sound of the waves. "The drug was supposed to wipe you clean, Aria. But you were always too stubborn to stay quiet. Come here. Let's go home." "I am home," Aria said. She stopped walking, leaving 10 feet of empty space between them. She let her hands hang loose by her sides, inches from her weapons. "And I didn't come here to surrender. I came to give you a message." The chairman's smirk faded into a hard line. "You think you can negotiate? You brought one man. I have an army. I don't need to negotiate because you don't have anything left to bargain with," Aria said smoothly. "Before we left the estate, I linked the laptop to a timer. The moment my boots hit this pier, the timer hit 0. Every offshore bank account, every bribe you've ever paid to the police, every shipping route you use, it was all sent to the authorities and every rival family in Seoul." The chairman's face went completely pale. The empire he had built over decades was turning to dust in a matter of seconds. "You're lying," he hissed, taking a step back. Check your phone, Tae-jin said. He stepped out of the fog, standing right beside Aria. He didn't even have his gun drawn yet. He just looked at the chairman with pure, cold pity. One of the chairman's men pulled out a buzzing phone, his eyes widening in panic as he read the screen. He looked at his boss and nodded slowly. It was over. Kill them, the chairman screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He turned and bolted toward a waiting speedboat at the edge of the dock. The pier exploded into chaos, but Aria didn't flinch. She drew her gun and fired. She didn't think about the mechanics of it. She just let her instincts take over. Beside her, Tae-jin moved with brutal efficiency. He didn't waste bullets. Every shot he took dropped a man to the ground. They moved together, covering each other's blind spots like they had been fighting side by side their entire lives. Aria charged through the center, her muscle memory guiding her through the chaos. She ducked under a spray of glass, rolled across the wet wood, and came up firing. She was literally just dismantling them. She saw the men she had once trained, saw the fear in their eyes as they realized their teacher had come back to collect her debt. Aria ignored the henchman and now went straight for the chairman. He was fumbling with the keys to the boat, his hands shaking violently. When he heard her boots on the wooden planks, he spun around, pulling a silver combat knife from his coat. He lunged at her, swiping the blade toward her throat. It was a fast, desperate move. But Aria knew it was coming. She was the one who had taught him that exact strike years ago. She sidestepped the blade with ease, grabbed his wrist, and twisted it sharply until the bone popped. The knife clattered to the deck. The chairman fell to his knees, clutching his broken arm. He looked up at her, finally showing the one thing she had never seen in his eyes before: pure, unadulterated terror. Aria, please, he begged, gasping for air. I made you who you are. I gave you a life. You made me a weapon, Aria corrected, staring down at him with cold, empty eyes. And weapons don't have mercy. She raised her gun, aimed right at the center of his chest, and pulled the trigger twice. The chairman collapsed backward onto the wooden boards, his sightless eyes staring up at the foggy sky. It wasn't a grand, theatrical death. It was just the end of a very bad man. The gunfire behind her faded into complete silence. Aria lowered her weapon, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. The adrenaline was leaving her body, leaving her shaking and exhausted. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Tae-jin stopped right behind her, dropping his empty gun onto the dock. He reached out, his large hands gently gripping her shoulders. He turned her around to face him. His face was smeared with dirt, and his shirt was torn, but his dark eyes were burning with an intensity that took her breath away. Are you hit? He asked, his voice rough and breathless. His hands moved over her arms, checking for blood. I'm okay, Aria whispered. I'm okay. It's over. Tae-jin stopped moving. He looked down at her, his gaze dropping to her lips. The professional distance, the careful boundaries they had kept for days, vanished in an instant. He didn't ask for permission. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her jawline, and crashed his lips against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, claiming, and fierce. It was the release of every terrifying moment they had survived since she first stumbled into his headlights. Aria let out a soft gasp and grabbed the lapels of his vest, pulling him even closer. She kissed him back with everything she had, tasting salt, rain, and the undeniable truth that she finally belonged somewhere. When Tae-jin finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily in the cold air. You're not a ghost anymore, he murmured, his thumb brushing over her cheek. You're mine. 10 months later, the Iron District was entirely transformed. The gang wars were dead, replaced by a quiet, highly profitable peace. Inside the Corvino estate, the sun poured through the large windows of the study. Aria sat at the massive mahogany desk, reviewing the legal contracts for their new shipping company. She was dressed in a comfortable sweater that slipped slightly off her shoulder, revealing the dark ink of the scorpion. She didn't hide it anymore. It was just a reminder of a life she had left behind. The door opened, and Tae-jin walked in holding 2 cups of coffee. He set one down in front of her and leaned over the back of her chair, pressing a soft kiss to the side of her neck. You've been staring at those screens for 3 hours, he said, his voice a warm rumble against her skin. Come back to bed. Aria smiled, turning her head to catch his lips in a slow, lingering kiss. Just give me 5 minutes to close this deal. Take your time, Tae-jin said, pulling her gently against his chest. We have the rest of our lives. Aria looked out the window at the city below. The rain had stopped, the sky was clear, and for the first time in her life, the future was entirely hers to write. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and impossible choices, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-stopping love stories just like this. And hey, turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next twist of passion and suspense.